Hello, if you're new to this channel and you're interested in coverage on the Chris Watts case by someone who's written a couple of books on the case, also the author and editor of the Crime Rocket blog, please subscribe to this channel, like, share, leave a comment. It's very important that you share on your social media networks, especially Facebook. You can also find more in-depth coverage from True Crime Rocket Science on Patreon at patreon.com/TCRS.
But sometime between August 12th and August 13th, Bella and Cece had their last bedtime. Because whether you believe Chris or the police, it seems one of the parents killed those little girls, which might be why investigators were spotted doing this. Hauling out all the bedding, sheets, comforters maybe, hauling it out of the house in what looked like trash bags in the days after the Watts girls died. The question now is, what those bed sheets might actually reveal.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, episode 15 in the ongoing Christopher Watts What Else Do We Know series, we are dealing with the last couple of points in the October section of the chronological timeline, number 25 to 44. Pretty much all of this deals with the furore over the autopsy reports. Before we go through that, I want to address the clip played at the beginning of this episode, where you hear Ashley Banfield saying that, one of the parents put the children to bed for the last time on Sunday night. I don't believe that happened. I believe Chris Watts wanted an exit out of his family. I believe he didn't want to be the patriarch of the family anymore. He didn't want to be married to Shanann. He didn't want to be a father to the unborn child. And I think he also realized he didn't want to be, not so much that he didn't want to be the father to Bella and Cece, but he wanted to be with Kessinger. That was sort of his motivation. And because he wanted to be with Kessinger, I think he felt a sense of that he felt obliged to look after his children. This had suddenly felt like a burden. Obviously, in the time that the children were away, they'd bonded with their mother. They'd also gotten sort of a sense of anxiety about certain things, for example, nuts and so on. We know that was playing in Bella's mind, on Saturday night, as late as Saturday night, that she was anxious about that. And so even on that night, Bella was struggling to sleep. And as most parents know, putting children to sleep can be quite a difficult job. It's sometimes quite difficult getting children to settle down. And Chris Watts had other things on his mind. He wanted to get back to his mistress. And, that night he had a very long conversation with her, 111 minutes, almost 2 hours. And so the issue is, would he have wanted to put his children to bed under those circumstances and maybe have to sort of put the phone down or whatever while they were sleeping? The other aspect is, if he was speaking at night to his mistress, and according to him, they had phone sex that night, there was also the risk that wouldn't his children, especially Bella, wouldn't they sort of be aware of it? And, wouldn't he be worried that one of his children could have told Shanann kind of what is going on? I'm just saying you need to think that far. And so I don't really think the children were put to bed that night. I think they were killed earlier in the evening. I don't even think they were given dinner, because virtually no food was found in the autopsies, and the autopsy is really the subject matter of today's episode. I remember being very curious, even more than curious, being very interested in the autopsy report specifically to find that particular aspect out is, what was the stomach contents going to be like in the children? Because that was going to give you some indication of time of death. And the fact that virtually nothing was found in their stomach contents, I think, proves that they went to bed, that they were killed prior to having dinner, which means very early in the evening. And you can argue it the other way. You could argue that they were killed very late, so very late in the morning when there was an opportunity for digestion, and possibly when they had a chance to visit the bathroom. I just don't think that's very likely. I think it's leaving things to the last moment. And there were sort of no traces in the bathroom either. I do think this is kind of an area where the information is missing. We don't know what was found on those blankets. I don't know whether that's been withheld in terms of the discovery or whether there was virtually nothing found. But one would imagine if something was found in the blankets at home, that would indicate, that the crime had happened there. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't release that kind of information if something was found. And I think the same applies to the bed in Shanann's bedroom. So if you're going to make the case that the murders happened at the well site, that is your best argument, is that there doesn't appear to be any evidence from the beds that the murders occurred in any of the bedrooms or the beds, right? Other than the fecal matter found on the one pillow cover. Other than that, and the certain amount of interest from the cadaver dogs, there isn't really much evidence in the house. Another thing I want to draw your attention to in terms of the Ashley Banfield coverage is, as far as I know, this was her very last report on the Watts case, and shortly after that she went off the air and she left HLN. And I think it's very ominous that the last thing she spoke about was this legal battle over the autopsy reports. I think if there were vested interests that didn't want attention on the Watts case, didn't want the plea deal scuppered, then this area especially, the interest, especially from the media but also from the public in the autopsy reports, this was something they wouldn't have wanted to get a lot of publicity. And one of the things that was interesting, if you go and look through the ticker tape reports, is that Chris Watts was even okay with releasing the autopsy reports. Now, in the FACE Swetley case, her autopsy reports have been, I won't say made available, but the autopsy has been conducted and they found that she was strangled, I believe, asphyxiated. I'm not quite sure whether she was manually strangled or smothered, but I'm under the impression it was a manual strangulation. Although I'm sensitive to the situations involved and the feelings of the community and her mother, it would help the true crime community to know just the detail. For example, like, was there damage to her hyoid bone? Because that would indicate manual strangulation. If she had fibers in her lungs or something, and anyway, that could indicate suffocation. Also, if a ligature was used, and then there wouldn't be damage to the hyoid bone, that would indicate ligature strangulation. It would just be interesting to know that, but again, this is an example of why sometimes there's an innocent and maybe even a good reason why autopsy reports are withheld. It's not always a conspiracy. Of course, in this case, the perpetrator committed suicide, so there's no need to protect him. This is protecting the dignity of the victim and the victim's mother. And in the Watts case, I think the legal shenanigans are totally different. I think there were much bigger interests at heart. I think there was the legal need, the legal necessity to protect the plea deal. But, and this is an area that maybe you guys can kind of do some homework on if you're interested. I was really surprised when all of this was going down that we didn't really hear much more from Scott Reich, who's a Colorado-based defense attorney. And maybe some of you on this channel who follow him can kind of ask him about this is, he's a defense attorney. Were the motions and the sort of all the legal floundering around this particular thing, was that in his mind completely normal jurisprudence, or was it normal legal protocol, or was it a bit odd? I don't really remember him saying much about it at the time, but I do know that he tried to apply for the autopsy results that have not been available. In other words, implying that there is some supplementary, or possibly some supplementary report that we haven't seen. And I think he's been rebuffed in that regard. But I just wonder what his opinion is on the legal protocols. If you look at all these motions, which we're going to go through now, not in a lot of detail, just briefly, we look at the motions and we look at the whole situation. What was going on? Was it just to protect the plea deal, or could there have been more going on? How much of this is normal? How much of this is odd? And it would be good to get a legal defense expert speaking about this. I certainly have knowledge about it, but I certainly don't claim to be an absolute expert on it. All I can say is it is, for me, very strange. And so from there, let's get started with this episode, number 15, on what else do we know. So we go to point number 25. On Friday, October 12th, Weld County District Court denied Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke's request to keep the autopsies under seal. And then this led to kind of a battle. And you can go to the blog post under the first post under the What's tab on Crime Rocket. If you scroll virtually halfway down, you'll get the original story. Number 26, Weld County Coroner Carl Blesch has already communicated his intentions in terms of the Watts family autopsy reports. He intends to file a response between October 15 and 17 to state his intention not to release the autopsy reports. So even though the court denied Michael Rourke's request, the district attorney's request, now you had the coroner kind of rallying to his cause, saying, well, I'm not going to let you release the autopsy reports. And there's also an article there. You can head to the blog to read it. Number 27, on October 12th, Weld County Court provided the first receipt for sealed visitor logs involving the defendant, Chris Watts. So that now that's also under seal. So it just seems like at this point, the whole legal narrative was battening down the hatches, and it would be really interesting to get, as I've said, Scott Reich's opinion on this. Is all of this normal? Number 28, predicted at number 25, but yes, confirmation. It's a tweet from Madeleine St. Amour from Times Call, a journalist from Times Call, who tweets, new in hashtag Chris Watts case, Weld City Coroner or County Coroner now petitioning to seal autopsies, hearing not yet set, story to come. That was tweeted October 15th or 16th. Number 29, the Weld County Coroner filed a petition Monday requesting the court keep the autopsy reports sealed. Carl Blesch stated in a news conference Monday, or a news release, that a hearing on the request to seal the reports had not yet been set. It's quite interesting that they decided to seal the reports, but they're not going to say when they're going to sort of talk about it. So you kind of get a sense of delaying the sort of transparency of what's going on. What's also very interesting is the autopsy reports were completed officially on October the 1st, but the Weld County District Attorney had filed a motion requesting that they be kept from the public. It could be because of the blood alcohol results. It could be that Chris Watts may have seen a possible loophole there for himself. One wonders whether his own defense attorneys didn't mention it to him. But I'm not going to go through the rest of the coverage there. Again, you can go and read the article that's posted on Crime Rocket. One thing I do think is interesting is, if you think about all the floundering, the legal floundering going on, and the attempts to just lock everything down, just keep all information quiet, and then this is going on starting kind of October 1st, but basically, people were aware of it by the middle of October. It was sort of, getting on the media's radar and on the public's radar, what is going on with these autopsy reports. And bear in mind, that's also when Ashley Banfield was sort of reporting on it, around about the 11th of October. And if you see it in context, that 1 month later, despite all of this, and despite the fact that they were going to go to court in December with the media to talk about the, whether they were going to release the autopsy reports, in the end they released a huge amount of information on November 19th, including the autopsy reports such as they were. And so you've got to ask yourself, well, they released them anyway, and they released them before they even went to court. So what was all the fuss about? Well, the fuss did seem to be about making sure the plea deal happened, making sure the public didn't catch wind of what was in the autopsy reports. And then you've got to ask, well, what if they had? What would have happened? And I think a couple of things could have happened. One is, some members of the public are obviously friends and family of Chris Watts. They may have sort of seen what is in the autopsies and said, and Chris Watts himself may have seen it if he hadn't seen it before, and said, well, there's nothing here. There's nothing here that's actually implicating you. There's no evidence against you in terms of the autopsies. And if you think about it further than that, there was actually very little evidence directly implicating Chris Watts, other than circumstantial evidence that he last saw his family and where they ended up. I mean, that is pretty compelling. But in terms of direct evidence, there wasn't really much. So it may just have been a skittish district attorney that's maybe not done a lot of murder trials, that's trying to just be very careful that it gets the right outcome here. But it could also be other interests at heart, making sure that there isn't a case, that there isn't a full-blown criminal trial. Point number 30, and again, this is where Scott Reich could maybe weigh in and talk about how unusual this was and what it might be pointing to. But I wrote at the time, things are certainly getting more and more unusual in the Watts case. Now Watts wants privacy around a sealed motion based on a health insurance law that protects private information. But this only applies to living people. And so I think this did apply to the blood alcohol aspect. It could have applied to information around Thrive, maybe even Shanann's income, I don't know. It could also have something to do with the toxicology and Shanann's use of oxycodone, I don't know. In any event, that was sealed as well. So we don't know what that was all about. Madeleine Saint-Amor also, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her name, sorry about that. Don't know if it's Amor or Amor. October 16th, she tweeted also just saying, in an unusual move, the hashtag Chris Watts defense attorneys asked to file sealed motion that will contain health information. You can go and look at that tweet and read the article. Also, it's also posted on Crime Rocket. Number 31, again, now I'm just reinforcing, I'm just not sure what to make of what is going on. I wrote, not sure what to make of this latest legal document in The People of the State of Colorado versus Christopher Watts. And it is titled, Mr. Watts' Motion for Leave to File a Pleading Under Seal Pursuant to Administrative Order. What I believe this could be, and this is just speculation, but I believe this was the actual secret filing of the of the plea. So, in other words, that he was going to admit to all the crimes, right? So bear in mind, at this time of the autopsy reports being sealed, where there's this sort of battle to keep them out of the public domain, right around this time, it looks like Watts submits his plea affidavit, basically saying, I admit to all the crimes and throw me in jail for the rest of my life, kind of thing. And this is also done kind of in secret. Bear in mind that something precipitated an earlier hearing on the 6th of November, and I would submit that it was this. So something had to be submitted to the court that moved the original hearing, which was scheduled for November 19, up. And one can also imagine that there was a need to get things, to hurry things up so that they could tie up this case and be done with it before anything went wrong, before someone second guessed, before someone had second thoughts. Doesn't that make sense? Number 32, media associations plan to oppose second petition to seal autopsies. That's also in the Times call. I'm not going to go through the article except to highlight where Rourke said the autopsies contain information that would be critical evidence at the trial, and that early release of that evidence could taint potential jurors. I just don't think that that is actually true. Like, I don't think there was any intention of having a trial, and I don't think it would taint anybody, in a plea deal situation. So I don't think that this is actually true. And it would be interesting to hear from Scott Reich what he thinks about that. Would he regard that particular statement as just disingenuous? Would he regard it as just normal legal gameplay? Is it just legal strategy? Would he regard it as dishonest? Would he regard it as unlawful? It would just be interesting to know what he thinks about that. I do think, giving a bit of leeway to Rourke's statement here, that if it was something like the blood alcohol level, I think that was critical evidence. But the thing is, I don't think it's going to taint jurors. It might affect the outcome of the plea deal, but that's something completely different. Just another thing I want to highlight from the article is, and this is just from the Times call, he says, or it is written, the argument that releasing the autopsies would make interviewing witnesses or finding a jury more difficult, quote, is true any time autopsy reports are released before trial, end quote, he said, which I think is Rourke. It might be Rourke or Zandsberg. I think it might be Zandsberg, which is a media attorney. So it's not clear who actually said that. Anyway, he goes on, that's a categorical rule, not unique to circumstances of this one trial. So what is being said here is that the circumstances here are kind of normal, which I don't agree with. But it's been kind of conflated with, guys, relax. This is everything that's happening is completely normal. These circumstances aren't unique, but I think they were. At the time, Zandsberg said that Rourke's argument didn't meet the burden of substantial injury to the public, and I tend to kind of agree with that. Unless you say, if has to now be a trial, that is injury to the public. I really don't see that. And I think time has shown that what the Watts case really did need was a trial. In other words, I would say injury to the public is not having a trial. Wouldn't you agree? Wouldn't you agree that it is a disservice and an injustice to the public not to have a trial, to see justice done in this case? And so you have a very interesting situation in hindsight where public documents are being withheld from the public who want access to it, but what they're being told is they are being denied it because it's in their interest. It's in the public interest that this information is withheld. Or was it really? Can you say that Chris Watts' plea deal was in the public interest? It was maybe in the Russek's interest, but can you conflate the Russek's interest with the public interest? Maybe you can. I don't know if that's. What do you think about that? Number 33, the latest People magazine article analyzes the impact of oil on DNA. The prosecution sees it as necessary to try to use as another nail in the coffin, basically, but the DNA by itself is really not all that informative in these kinds of cases. And that's a quote from Dr. Phil Danielson. So it's not Dr. Phil, it's from Dr. Phil Danielson, a professor at the University of Denver's Department of Biological Sciences, who specializes in DNA collection and analysis. In short, this is not going to be a DNA case. One of the most important factors will be time of death, food contents in the stomach, if there is any, and clothing. If the kids and Shanann were wearing any, will prove more decisive in calculating time of death. And, again, what happened when we did see the autopsy results, there was no food. The lack of food contents tended to support the fact that the children died earlier in that they hadn't been given any dinner. And you can kind of imagine if Chris Watts wanted to check out of his family, why would he make another dinner for his kids? Why would he put them to bed if none of that was going to be necessary? I mean, think about it like this. If you thinking of going on a trip and you've got to make all those arrangements and then you decide beforehand you're not going to go on that trip, why would you pack bags and make arrangements only just for none of that to pan out? It's the same kind of thing. Instead, you would simply not do that. I'll give you another example. If you're living together with someone and you don't know what the person you're living with is planning to do in terms of, they're going to stay with you or they're going to move out. One thing that's going to show you that is if they kind of stop buying groceries and the refrigerator starts being bare, and normal maintenance activities they don't undertake. What is all of that showing? It's showing that they've already started thinking about this other life that they're going to have, where they don't want to maintain things in this domicile because they're already mentally in another one. And the same is going to apply with Chris Watts. Do you see that? So you're not going to want to put them to bed. You're not going to want to pack the lunches for the next day or pack backpacks or read the book about the marriage. None of that. You have already checked out even before the murders were committed. Number 34, on October 19th, Chris Watts' defense submit a 3-page civil motion requesting that the disclosure of the autopsy report be denied to the media and the public. And this is quite interesting because if you go back to that ticker tape, at the bottom of the screen when Ashley Banfield was making her case, it refers to Watts not opposing the release of the autopsy reports. So it's about a week later, there's a change of mind. And it's almost like after he submitted the plea agreement, the legal apparatus now kind of went out of his hands. It's almost like he empowered his attorneys to do things to make sure the plea deal happened. And one of this was now changing his stance on the autopsy reports. All I'm saying is you can kind of see that there's an intensive, urgent effort to shut down all the information. Right? You can go to the original blog post to read the full report. I'm just going to quote 2 aspects that are bolded. One was that Mr. Watts respectfully moves this court to hold a hearing on whether the release of the autopsies could result in tainting witnesses that have not yet been interviewed. And that's still pretending that there's going to be a court case, because ultimately there weren't any witnesses. And then the other one also refers to witnesses who have yet to be interviewed. Now, one aspect about this that is, I think, interesting is, I think at this time, Detective Baumhover was still checking out blood alcohol levels. So he was investigating, he was interviewing witnesses, but in terms of the blood alcohol level. And if they had heard about this, it could have changed what they said to him. I'm just going to read point number 3 in the full report. It refers to, as stated in Mr. Watt's notice D039, the government's alternative claim that the results of the autopsies will taint potential jurors is groundless. The results will almost assuredly be revealed in court proceedings well in advance of trial. And that is not true. That whole thing... bear in mind, at this time they knew about the plea deal and they knew what they were doing. So all of this is talking about stuff that they know is not going to happen. So, when they say the results will be almost assuredly revealed in court proceedings, well, they weren't. And they certainly weren't revealed in advance of any trial, were they? So can you see how there's kind of a legal strategy going on here from both sides? And I'm not very comfortable with it. Even in this motion, there's a sense of ominous uncertainty where at point number 5, it stresses, it is not clear if the government's assertion means that it has knowledge that witnesses may change their testimony once they see the coroner's opinion. It is not clear which witnesses the government knows about who have not been interviewed that may have that reaction to the opinion of the coroner. And I'll put this in bold, it is not clear what information the government possesses that would lead them to that conclusion. And then jumping to the end, the coroner's naked deference to the government has therefore made clear that he has no interest in challenging the government's judgment. Consequently, he has no interest in investigating and ferreting out the validity of its claim. Mr. Watts does. And so what I wrote at the time was, it's interesting how the defense are shooting warning shots over the bow, basically alleging that the coroner is in cahoots with the district attorney's office. The tone of the motion also indicates the tone of Chris Watts' defense. It's defiant. I'm just going to touch on the bold sections in points 7, 8, and 14, where it just references to Mr. Watts is constitutionally entitled to know, and he wants to know the veracity or credibility of certain information. He talks about Mr. Watts' request to intervene must hold a hearing in this case, and then it refers here to, if the civil court denies the request to intervene, due process requires this honourable court to hold a hearing anyway. Denying such a hearing continues to erode and undermine Mr. Watts' right to meet and defend the accusations against him. He has the right to a fundamentally fair proceeding comporting with due process of law. So much ado, and it seems to be saying Mr. Watts insists on having a hearing. And wasn't that hearing ultimately the hearing of November the 6th? Point number 35, another motion, Chris Watts' motion for alternative relief in the event that this motion to intervene is denied. Wow. So they've submitted a motion like in advance in case this one was denied. So you can see how they are really putting their feet on the accelerator. Let's get something going here. 36, Chris Watts case, order C21, filed on October 22nd, 2018. Weld County Court grants motion to submit health-related information under seal. 37, and this is from True Crime Rocket Science. I said that the Watts dog Dieter raised the alarm. The dog's frantic barking on the morning of the murders caused Nicole Atkinson to call the police to do a wellness check. I know that sticks out like a sore thumb, but that did prove to be somewhat validated by the Atkinson transcripts, where she said that one of the reasons she went to the Watts home was because of the dog, because she had been dog sitting, she had access to the home because of the dog. One thing that I found very frustrating about the coverage there was when Kunrad is knocking on the door, and at one point he's standing right at the door, and the door is slightly ajar. And also when he's standing at the garage, you can kind of hear a dog barking faintly. And they never talk about Dieter. They never refer to Dieter. Now, at that point, Dieter was probably in the basement. And we know Koenraad knocked on the basement window. We also know that Nicole and Koenraad shouted through the front door, and Dieter would undoubtedly have heard that. Are you telling me you wouldn't have heard a dog barking from downstairs in the basement, even if the basement door was closed, coming through that front door? I think you would have heard it. And no one really remarked on that. Even though no one remarked on that, I think that nevertheless happened. And the fact that the dog was in the house barking made them feel, wow, something is definitely wrong. I'm not saying that's the sole cause of what raised the alarm, but I think the fact that the dog was inside barking was also kind of a cause for concern. What is going on? Where is the dog? But of course, when they were asked about it, and you had the official interrogation, the dog's interest and the dog aspect slides down in terms of the priority. But I nevertheless think it was a factor. Point number 38, should Chris Watts face the death penalty? A look at capital punishment in Colorado. So this is what people were thinking about at the time. I think mistakenly, I mean, there shouldn't have been. This is kind of like fake news talking about the death penalty in Colorado. Point number 39, and you can find the link at the article. Christopher Watts' attorneys want Weld DA out of autopsy battle. That's quite interesting. And that was from the Greeley Tribune. Number 40, update. Court rules Watts' attorneys Weld DA can join legal scrap over autopsy reports. Greeley Tribune. So all of this was about that they were going to have one huge fight in court with the media on a particular date, which ended up being sometime in December, and that never ultimately happened. 41. In an informal poll on a Chris Watts Facebook group, 70% say they believe Chris Watts' version of events, that there was an argument just prior to the murders. True Crime Rocket Science was in the minority saying, and I felt that all along, that there was no argument. And so only 30% believed or disbelieved Chris Watts on that aspect. Point number 42, you can go and look at that if you're interested. It's the route to Survey 319 in pictures. Someone actually drove out there and recorded video, and so that was provided towards the end of October. 43, Chris Watts' Metallica tattoo on his back, what does it mean? That was something I wrote about in the book Two-Faced Two Pollyannas. I just looked at the symbolism of the tattoos and certain other aspects. The Metallica music he was listening to, it was just something that I analyzed. And then the final point on in October, 44, also fittingly deals with the autopsy results. It talks about the hearing on the autopsy reports for Shanann and her two daughters will take place at 9 o'clock on December 21st before Weld District Court Judge Todd Taylor. To me, that kind of thing shows the game, shows how the public was gamed by the legal fraternity, by Weld County. That was never meant to happen. It was meant to sort of postpone the wrangling over it, the arguing over it. It was meant to buy space and time, and while they bought space and time, they rushed through the plea deal and all the rest of it. And it would be interesting to hear from Scott Reich. Would you say that it is better practice to release autopsy results to the public prior to a trial, or can one not necessarily say that? Are there certain conditions where you wouldn't release the autopsy reports? And then further, knowing what was in the autopsy reports, were they justified in holding them back? And were they justified in holding them back the way they were held back, with this sort of legal shenanigans? And then the very final point for October 2018, the status conference to determine the dates of the criminal trial is on November 19th at the same venue. And as we know, that ended up being the sentencing hearing, and then there was the plea deal hearing, which nobody knew about until the hearing actually happened, which happened on November 6th. And at this point, that November the 6th date hadn't been announced. So at the end of October, the November 6th date hadn't been even announced. So the notice was very, very short. And so that brings us to the end of this episode. In the next episode in the series, episode 16, we'll start with the very interesting month of November 2018. We'll go through that chronology. If you're interested in this kind of coverage and this particular series, I'm also covering the Van Gogh saga. It's basically right now, between now and July, were the last couple of months of his life. And this year is the 130-year anniversary of his death. So I'm basically chronicling the last significant days of his life and events of his life as we go through that chronology as well. So you might find that quite interesting as well. If you think it might be of interest to you, please subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notifications, like, share, leave a comment. In terms of Patreon, at the moment I'm uploading the last book in the Two-Face series, which is 9 books. The last book is FACE EPILOGUE. In a way, that book's been very sort of neglected or forgotten about, just because it's not part. When you click on the link for all the books in the series, that book isn't included. I'm not sure exactly why, but that is the 9th and final book in the Two-Face series. It's called Epilogue. The audiobook is available now on Patreon. I've already uploaded, I think, the introduction and first 3 chapters. I'm uploading about 2 chapters every day. So by about the first week of March, that audiobook should be available on Patreon under the $5 tier. Then in terms of Silver Fox is also available as an audiobook on Patreon. Someone's just left a really validating review. I'm very grateful for it. You can check that out if you're interested. Just somebody on this YouTube channel who didn't know me and who went from watching my videos, listening to the videos, to reading one of my books and being pleasantly surprised. So you might want to just read the review and see what you think, and then maybe take the step and maybe read one of my books. And you're going to get a lot more in-depth analysis than you're getting here, which is where I don't really prepare a script. I do try and anchor what I'm saying in the basic fabric of what you're talking about, but obviously the narrative in the books is much more streamlined, much more finely tuned. It's edited, it's seamless, it's done very professionally. So maybe check out one of the books, and then you might find something out about this case that you hadn't thought about before. You might think certain things about this case that you hadn't considered before. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.